The Galactic Concord did not die in a fire. It died in the silence between heartbeats. For 3 centuries, the High Senate had treated Earth as a coordinate on a map that could be erased by a stray diplomatic insult or a miscalculated trade tariff. They called the planet the Ghost Sector, a mythic scar upon the galactic spine where energy signatures screamed and then faded into the vacuum of nothingness. When the Voss fleets arrived, crimson-skinned raiders clad in armor woven from living starlight, the Concord assumed they were hunting ghosts. The Voss burned systems whole, turning habitable worlds into glass geodes to prove their supremacy over entropy itself. It was a Tuesday when the Council's High Chancellor, Varan Thalos of the Ziran hegemony, received the report that would break his spine more than the orbital bombardments did his capital cities. The sensors were wrong, every time, but the math held up even as the numbers defied comprehension. In the sector known historically as the Black Spiral, a graveyard of neutron stars where light bent back upon itself before fading, the anomaly registered not as energy, but as mass. Not a single vessel, a gravity well so dense it swallowed the telemetry from 3 dead satellites in unison. Thalos stood behind the obsidian viewport of the Imperial Scepter, the last functioning flagship of the Concord's 3rd Fleet. Outside, the sky was bleeding violet plasma. The Voss dreadnoughts hung like bloated carcasses over the shattered rings of Thalos Prime, their organic hulls pulsing with bioluminescent command codes that meant surrender. To the Zirans, war was a negotiation conducted through resonance frequencies and psychic pressure fields. It was elegant. It was efficient. It was soft. The Voss understood only one language: expansion without friction. They had spent millennia mastering the art of flow. Their ships looked like seeds blown by cosmic winds, sleek, tapered hulls that defied drag, cloaking themselves in the local magnetic fields to become ghosts before they ever engaged a target. Thalos had watched them dismantle the trade guilds with surgical precision. He had calculated their kill ratios and compared them against the orbital debris of previous conquests. They were gods of kinetic efficiency who forgot the weight of stone. The gravity shear is off axis, Chancellor, Commander Hicks said from his station. Hicks was a Ziran tactical officer, his skin patterned with shifting violet scales that rippled when stress hit the bloodline thresholds. He did not look at Thalos. He looked at the primary sensor array, which whined with a low, metallic complaint like a dying engine block. We are registering 3 distinct mass concentrations approaching from the Black Spiral. They do not respond to our hails. Not even our standard resonance pulse. Thalos felt the coldness of his own breath against the glass. This was not an invasion. It was an insertion. They cannot be physical. We have mapped every tonnage in this quadrant for 6 cycles. There is no room for that much density without a void signature, and their presence causes the local curvature to spike like a mountain peak in a flat desert. Or, Hicks corrected softly, his scales turning a pale gray, there are ships built with physics we have yet to account for. We thought the Black Spiral was empty because nothing survived there. Perhaps they did not survive before. Perhaps the debris field is just a graveyard of hulls that never learned how to float. Thalos turned from the viewport then, walking toward the command console where the holographic map of the sector drifted like dust motes in a sunbeam. The Concord had spent its history currying favor with the great powers of the deep void, assuming their own longevity was an evolutionary constant. They treated time as a river that flowed only one way, from power to glory to peace. They never considered time as a machine that could be wound backwards by someone who refused to pay for fuel. On the main screen, the 3 concentrations coalesced. It wasn't a formation in the military sense. It was not Voss geometry or Ziran lattice work. It was a blockage. 3 massive slabs of matter sliding against each other with terrifying friction, held together by the sheer weight of their own existence. There were no glowing command pylons. No delicate sensor arrays extending from bulbous noses. The hulls were matte black, absorbing light rather than reflecting it. They looked less like vessels and more like monuments erected in space to defy the expansion of the universe itself. They are not cloaking, Thalos said, his voice sounding thin inside the reinforced bulkhead. They are hiding behind darkness. By definition, Chancellor, you cannot hide from a gravity sensor with darkness, Hicks replied. He reached for the comms channel that linked to the Voss dreadnought leading the blockade. His fingers hovered over the interface. We could try to open a handshake protocol, to request identification codes, or we could attempt a warning pulse. Identify them first, Commander. If they are hostile, do not engage until I see the structure of their weaponry. Thalos moved to his own station, looking at the tactical readout that had been scrolling in silent red for an hour. The Voss were readying their primary resonators. On the screen, the purple energy fields curled like serpents waiting to strike. Do you understand what this mass profile is? A Xeran dreadnought weighs less than a mountain range compared to this. This is not engineering. This is geology. The silence on the line was heavier than the gravity well outside the hulls. The Voss ship commander had cut their channel. They could sense the anomaly approaching, and for the first time in 1,000 cycles of galactic history, the predators were afraid of prey that did not hunt. On Thalos' screen, the 3 human ships, designations unreadable, perhaps because the script was carved into steel rather than projected by light, adjusted their vector. They did not turn. They simply pivoted on their axis like tectonic plates shifting in a deep sea trench. The lead ship opened fire. It was not energy. There was no shimmer of photon torpedoes or the soft hum of plasma discharge. The alert system screamed, but it was a mechanical scream, hardwired into the spine of the scepter. It was the sound of tungsten hitting glass. Outside, the Voss blockade did not disperse. They flared their shields to maximum resonance, turning their hulls into mirrors that threw back light with blinding intensity. But there were no photons in this shot. There was only the impact of a cylinder traveling at 90% of the speed of light. It struck the Voss lead warship not on its front arc, where the organic armor would have shattered, but through its gravitational center. The hull did not explode outward in a spherical cloud of fire. It inverted. The ship folded in half like paper caught in a vise, metal shrieking as it attempted to compress against a force that ignored structural integrity entirely. Thalos watched the telemetry as if watching his own heart stop. There was no energy discharge recorded on the Voss shields because there was nothing to shield against but the raw momentum of mass moving at near light speeds. The human weapon had not fired a beam. It had fired an asteroid wrapped in steel. It passed through the plasma shielding, through the organic armor, and simply ceased to exist inside the void behind the hull until gravity took over again, spilling the wreckage like a broken clock face into the dark. The lead Voss ship vanished from the sensor grid instantly. Not destroyed so much as subtracted. The remaining 2 dreadnoughts were already rolling off their axes, emergency thrusters flaring in desperate attempts to maintain formation while their captains tried to calculate why their predictive models had failed by 40%. "Commander," Thalos said, not looking up from the console where the readout of the impact site was still bleeding red numbers. "Do we hail them again?" Hicks's scales were now a solid white, the color of bone under anesthesia. He had seen enough wars to know that when the enemy stopped responding to reason and started answering with physics equations written in fire, diplomacy became suicide. "Their tactical signature is broadcasting on all frequencies, Chancellor. But it is not speaking. It is declaring." The 3rd human vessel engaged its forward thrusters, a burst of cold blue exhaust that did nothing against the black hulls but pushed them through the debris field like a piston. They were moving toward the Concord fleet now. Not for conquest. Not for plunder. The vector pointed directly at the Voss capital station, which was currently being held hostage by 3 Voss dreadnoughts and 10 smaller support craft. Thalos gripped the edge of his console until the metal bit into his palm. He realized then that he was not looking at a fleet. He was looking at an invoice. The universe had forgotten to bill Earth for the destruction of a dozen colonies, the burning of 3 major trade arteries, and the theft of the Helios drive patents 300 years prior. And this day, on a Tuesday in the winter cycle, someone had collected. "Stand by," Thalos whispered. He knew that if he ordered his own fleet to engage, they would die in seconds. The Voss were already dead. Their technology was merely waiting for gravity to sort them out. If the humans fired again, it wouldn't be a battle anymore. It would be an erasure. The massive hull of the first human ship filled the viewport behind Thalos, not by turning toward him, but by simply passing so close that the magnetic interference made the scepter's internal lights flicker like dying stars. The black surface was scarred with rivets that looked less like decoration and more like scars from collisions 1,000 generations ago. There were no windows on this side of the hull. No insignia save for the rough, hand-dipped paint marks of repair crews who had worked in 0G to hold together something meant to outlast the heat death of the system. "Chancellor," Hicks's voice cracked, stripped of its tactical discipline. "They are not broadcasting a weapon charge. They are broadcasting a map." Thalos looked at the secondary sensor array. It was overlaying their own star chart with coordinates that did not exist in the Concord database. Coordinates to every single Voss stronghold, every colony, and every mining outpost in the spiral arm. And attached to each coordinate was not an attack vector, but a time delay counter. They were not attacking Thalos Prime first. They were marking the debt. The human ship turned slowly toward the nearest Concord cruiser, a Xeran vessel built of flowing crystal and soft force fields. The cruiser's engines screamed as it tried to power its shielding against the approaching gravity well, but the hull groaned in sympathy with the pressure building outside. It was not a weapon system that needed charge-up time or trajectory calculations. It was an inevitability set in motion. Chancellor, Hicks said, the word barely audible over the vibration of the ship's frame. They are waiting for us to move. Thalos looked at the countdown on the screen. 5 minutes until the first coordinate detonated. 400,000 light-years away, a Voss mining station was currently being processed as fuel for the human fleet's warp drive. It did not know its own end yet, but it had been counted. Earth was not coming back to beg for peace. The myth of the ghost sector had returned not to haunt them in nightmares, but to hammer down on their reality with cold iron and tungsten. The scepter drifted forward on autopilot, a mouse caught inside the jaw of an elephant that had forgotten it was meat. Thalos placed his hands over the dead controls of the flagship's command chair. He thought about the archives he held in his mind, the treaties where humanity signed away their sovereignty to protect the galaxy from itself. They had traded survival for silence, believing they were buying time. The human ship did not fire its main battery yet. It simply adjusted its forward thrusters by 1 degree. A shift of mass that would turn the Concord fleet into debris before the first slug cleared the barrel of a railgun. Thalos closed his eyes as the countdown ticked past 3 minutes. He had spent 40 years ruling over a system of lies, and now he was learning that humanity did not lie to save face. They lied because they were too busy being what remained after war became obsolete. "Record this," Thalos said into the comms, his voice stripped of the Chancellor's title, leaving only the sound of a man accepting execution. "Tell the High Senate when the dust settles that we are not ghosts. We are just overdue." Part 2. The Battle of the Helios Expanse did not begin with a declaration, nor with the ringing of bells or the flashing of warning lights that marked the formalities of galactic warfare. It began with the sound of structural steel failing under the stress of impact, amplified 300 times through vacuum sensors and recorded in the memory banks of the Imperial Scepter like a funeral dirge played on a bone flute. Admiral Vance did not stand when the first slug cleared the muzzle of his lead railgun. He remained seated behind the reinforced composite desk of the Iron Meridian, which served as both bridge and mess hall in the tradition of old Earth fleets where command was not an activity, but a burden carried on the spine. His fingers hovered over the haptic interface, tracing the stress vectors of the enemy formation that hung suspended above him like moths against a windowpane. To Vance, they were not ships, they were calculations waiting to be solved. The Voss fleet, commanded by High Warlord Kalen Var, had spent 3 centuries perfecting the art of non-friction combat. They fought with grace, utilizing gravity wells to curve their own paths around enemy fire and deploying shield matrices that tasted light before it could strike them. Vance did not care for taste or light. He cared for mass, velocity, and the universal constant that governed both. When a Voss dreadnought flared its resonance shields, a shimmering aurora of violet energy meant to absorb kinetic impact, the human ship behind him simply fired again. There was no delay. The Meridian did not recharge batteries or cycle capacitors. It drew power from the inertia of the star itself and dumped it into a projectile of depleted uranium encased in a diamond lattice. The slug struck the Voss lead vessel on its port flank, just below the gravity stabilizer ring. In traditional combat terms, this was the soft side, the area where shielding was thinnest because it faced away from the primary weapons array. But Vance did not aim for softness, he aimed for continuity. He calculated that if a slug traveling at Mach 500 penetrated the hull, the shear force would propagate through the ship's spine faster than any alarm could signal the bridge. The Voss shields were designed to dissipate energy across a surface area. They were not designed to stop something that had no energy and only weight. The impact did not produce fire. Fire requires oxidation, which was impossible in the vacuum of space without an atmosphere. There was only shockwave propagation. A soundless thunderclap that registered as a spike on every seismic sensor from the capital to the outer rim. The Voss hull groaned, a sound transmitted through their internal comms like the creaking of a dying tree trunk under winter frost. They expected vaporization. They prepared for plasma discharge or ionized beams. Instead, the port quarter simply folded inward, as if the metal itself had remembered its malleability and decided to obey gravity rather than maintain its shape. "Target confirmed," Vance said into his comms channel. He did not speak to the crew. He spoke to the algorithm running on the tactical board. His voice was flat, devoid of the adrenaline that usually spiked during engagement protocols in the High Senate or even aboard the Concord fleets. "Reload cycle 314. Adjust trajectory for secondary impact on their drive core." The iron meridian did not accelerate. It simply shifted vector by 1/10 of a degree, enough to alter the lead slug's path so that it would strike the Voss flagship directly behind the hull breach where the main thrusters fed into the reactor. The second slug arrived in 4.3 seconds. By the time the Voss sensors registered the incoming mass profile, Vance had already calculated their deceleration rate based on the hull deformation of the first impact. He knew they would try to spin to avoid the next shot, but he did not give them time to correct their moment of inertia. On the bridge of the Scepter, Chancellor Thalos watched the telemetry stream through a private link Vance had established. The Xeran representative tried to understand how the humans were ignoring the laws of thermodynamics that governed all energy weapons. There was no heat signature, yet the Voss ship was becoming brittle. There was no radiation burst, yet their internal electronics fried with every pass of a slug through the local space-time curvature generated by the railgun's recoil field. "Their shields are failing," Hicks reported from his station on the Scepter. His violet scales were now a dull bruise color. Not because they are pierced, but because the kinetic shear is propagating molecular bonds apart faster than their regenerative fields can reassemble them. They are not blocking the bullets. The bullets are eating through their concept of structure. Vance heard this on his own channel and did not acknowledge it. He was watching a secondary target, a Voss cruiser that had attempted to flank the human line by diving into the debris field left by the first breach. It was a tactical error born of arrogance, the belief that chaos could be navigated with sufficient grace. The debris field was not random. It consisted of tungsten slugs that remained superheated and magnetically charged for days after firing. By entering the kill zone, the cruiser had invited itself to be turned into scrap by its own former allies' discarded ammunition. Vance fired a warning pulse, not a weapon, but a gravity well generator mounted on the Meridian's stern. It was not meant to crush the ship, merely to pin it in place against the local flow of space-time. The cruiser froze. Its engines screamed as their plasma drives tried to burn through an invisible wall that had no pressure or mass, only a change in the metric tensor itself. Vance allowed them 5 seconds of suspension. During this time, he ordered 3 light frigates from the rear line of his formation to shift their railguns into a rapid-fire configuration. "Free A1349, Vance said. "Fire at will." 300 tons of tungsten left the barrels in a continuous ribbon, not in slugs but in streams. It was like watching liquid metal solidify under pressure. The stream struck the suspended cruiser and did not break upon impact. Tungsten is harder than Voss alloy, denser than lead, and when fired from a railgun capable of overcoming light-speed friction coefficients, it does not just punch holes, it acts as an anchor. The cruiser's hull began to vibrate at a resonant frequency that matched the natural decay rate of the metal. It did not explode. It cracked along its seams like a drying clay pot under freezing rain. The structural integrity warnings on the Voss comms screamed in their native tongue, but Vance did not translate them. He understood the language of failure better than any diplomat ever could because he had spent his youth repairing hulls that didn't know how to die. Kalen Var's voice finally cut through the static on the open channel, stripped of its usual haughty resonance codes. It was a sound like someone trying to speak through thick glass. "Admiral Vance, you are violating the Galactic Treaty on Kinetic Warfare. You have no right to weaponize momentum in this quadrant." Vance stood up then. He walked past the tactical display, his boots ringing against the deck plates with a sound that echoed too loudly for a ship designed for silence. He looked at the screen where the Voss flagship was currently listing 30 degrees off axis, held together only by the tensile strength of its own titanium spine and the magnetic hold of Vance's gravity well generator. "The treaty is written in ink, warlord," Vance said, his voice carrying a weight that made the speakers on the Scepter vibrate in sympathy with his vocal cords. "Ink does not stop bullets. Metal stops metal. Your shields are for photons and plasma. Mine are for physics." He tapped the screen with 2 fingers, selecting the coordinate of the Voss flagship's primary coolant lines. The system highlighted them in red. a target designation that didn't require permission to engage. You asked me why we did not fire on your capital earlier. I told you then that I was collecting an invoice. This is item 4. He turned back to the tactical board, his face a mask of granite indifference. The Voss ship behind him shuddered as the Meridian shifted its thrusters again. Not for escape, but to align a secondary railgun mounted on the port flank with the exposed coolant manifold. Vance did not fire immediately. He let the silence stretch until the Voss crew realized that the delay was not tactical caution, but deliberate cruelty. They were waiting for them to try and disengage from their own gravity well generator, an action which would require them to burn through their remaining energy reserves instantly. If you retreat, Vance said, watching the Voss bridge lights flicker as they powered their own emergency thrusters against the invisible hand holding them down, I will classify this sector as hostile territory again. The Concord will be notified that the Voss hegemony has failed to acknowledge the debt owed by the Helios Accords of 2149. You threaten war, Kalen Var snapped, though his voice lacked its previous conviction. He was looking at his tactical officer now, who was frantically trying to calculate if they could break free from the gravity well before the third slug arrived. You cannot win a war with rocks. You are an engineer. We fight for concepts. Concepts do not stop tungsten, Vance corrected gently. He pressed a key on his desk interface, and the gravity well intensified by 10%. The Voss ship groaned again, but this time the sound was coming from the hull plating itself trying to fuse back together against the pressure of space. We fight for leverage. You think you have power because your shields glow purple. We know power is the weight of a hammer on a nail. He finally fired. The third slug did not hit the ship directly. It struck the gravity well anchor point he had placed behind them. It was a kinetic strike against the weapon used to hold them in place, designed to disrupt the magnetic field that kept their engines functional in deep space vacuum. The Voss flagship lurched violently, breaking its own suspension like a child pulling too hard on a kite string. The ship drifted backward into the debris field. Vance's frigates did not pursue them with weapons drawn, they pursued them with gravity generators turned on low power. They herded the broken enemy vessel away from their own fleet and toward the nearest black hole in the sector, a natural star that had died centuries ago and was slowly consuming everything around it for fuel. Clear channel, Vance said into his headset. The tactical board cleared itself of the Voss coordinates as if they never existed. We are moving to extraction point Alpha 7. Thalos watched the last frame of the combat feed before the signal cut out permanently, overwhelmed by the gravity well's interference. He sat back in his chair on the scepter, staring at the dark void where the 3 human ships had vanished. The Voss fleet was still there, drifting like a cloud of dust after a storm, their shields shattered not by energy but by the realization that some things cannot be deflected. They were waiting for the humans to fire again, or perhaps they were waiting for death itself to finish the job. Vance stood on the bridge of the Iron Meridian and looked at the starboard sensors. The Voss ships were no longer broadcasting their command codes. They had switched to emergency beacons, a universal frequency that screamed, "We are dead," into the void. He acknowledged it by changing his own broadcast signature from combat mode to escort mode. It was an act of terrifying bureaucracy. He did not want them destroyed in the dark. He wanted them catalogued as evidence. The human fleet turned on its primary thrusters, leaving a trail of blue plasma that looked like a comet tail moving against the wrong direction. Part 3. The air inside the shuttle bay of the Iron Meridian did not smell of the sterilized ozone or the floral synthetic pheromones of the Xeran hegemony. It smelled of hot oil, scorched shielding, and the sharp, metallic tang of recycled oxygen that had passed through 1,000 scrubbers. Chancellor Varan Thalos stepped off the transport craft, his ceremonial robes of woven light fiber fluttering in the sudden, heavy draft of the hangar. Behind him, 2 Xeran honor guards clutched their resonance staves, their scales rippling in a panicked, iridescent strobe. They were used to the grand cathedral ships of the Concord, where every bulkhead was a work of art. Here, they were surrounded by the architecture of a tomb. The hangar was a cavern of matte gray steel. There were no decorative pillars, no soft ambient lighting. Overhead, massive yellow cranes groaned as they hauled multi-ton tungsten slugs into the loading muzzles of the ship's internal railgun batteries. Human deck crews in grease-stained jumpsuits moved with a terrifying, rhythmic efficiency, ignoring the alien dignitaries as if they were nothing more than static interference. "This is not a flagship," Commander Hicks whispered, his scales turning a muddy, fearful brown. It is a factory that produces death. A human officer awaited them. She wore a charcoal gray uniform with no medals, only a simple name tape, Stark. Her eyes were tired, the skin around them mapped with the fine lines of someone who had spent decades looking at tactical displays in the dark. "Chancellor Thalos," she said. Her voice was not translated through a diplomatic AI. It was a flat, unornamented broadcast from a device on her collar. "The Admiral is finishing a maintenance report. Follow the yellow line. Do not touch the bulkheads. They are currently magnetized for debris shielding." Thalos followed, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. As they moved through the corridors, he realized the Meridian had no windows. The humans did not care for the view. They relied on sensors, logic, and the cold data of the void. Every few meters, they passed hatches marked with high-voltage warnings and structural load-bearing stats. There was no art here. The only beauty was the perfection of the machine. They reached the bridge, or what the humans called the command deck. It was a sunken pit of workstations centered around a holographic tactical table that flickered with the orange glow of a dying star. Admiral Vance was not standing at a pulpit. He was sitting on a swivel chair, a cup of dark, steaming liquid in one hand and a data slate in the other. He looked up as Thalos approached. His face was a landscape of pragmatism, cragged, scarred, and utterly devoid of the negotiation smile Thalos had spent a lifetime perfecting. "Chancellor," Vance said. He didn't stand. He didn't offer a gesture of peace. He simply gestured to the flickering map on the table. "You've lost 17% of your fleet in the last hour. The Voss are regrouping near the third moon. They think they found a flaw in our reload cycle." "Admiral," Thalos began, his voice trembling with a mixture of awe and desperation. "On behalf of the Galactic Concord, we cannot express the depth of our gratitude. We believed Earth was a myth. We believed you were gone." Vance took a slow sip of his drink. "We weren't gone. We were just busy. It takes a long time to forge enough tungsten to kill a galaxy." "You saved Thalos Prime," Hicks added, stepping forward. "The Voss were moments from glassing the capital. You are heroes of the—" Vance's eyes snapped to Hicks, cold and sharp as a bayonet. The Xeran officer went silent instantly, his scales turning a dead, chalky white. "We aren't heroes," Vance said. He tapped a key on the console. A document appeared on the screen, written in the archaic, blocky script of 22nd century Earth. In 2149, the Helios Accords were signed. The Galactic Concord promised Earth a seat on the High Senate in exchange for our FTL drive patents. Instead, you took the technology, realized we were too volatile for your elegant politics, and enacted the Ghost Sector sanctions. You cut our trade lines. You left 3 billion humans to starve on colony worlds that didn't have atmosphere processors yet. You didn't kill us. You just deleted us from the map. Thalos felt the weight of the history he had tried to ignore. "That was 3 centuries ago, Admiral. The Senate of today is a corpse," Vance interrupted. "And the Voss are the maggots. We didn't come here because we missed the friendship of the Concord. We came because the interest on that debt has reached a critical mass." He leaned forward, the orange light of the hologram casting deep shadows across his face. "We've spent 300 years in the black spiral. Do you know what happens to a species when you lock them in a graveyard? They stop dreaming of the stars and start learning how to dismantle them. We watched you from the dark. We watched the Voss burn your borders. We waited until they destroyed enough of your civilization that you wouldn't have the strength to argue when the bill arrived." Thalos felt a cold sweat breaking across his brow. "The bill? Admiral, we are in the middle of a war for survival." "No," Vance corrected. "The war for survival ended for you an hour ago when we arrived. Now, you're in a liquidation. We are currently dismantling every Voss outpost in the sector. Not to save you, but because their hulls contain raw materials we require for the next phase of our expansion." "What next phase?" Thalos whispered. Vance stood up then, and for the first time, Thalos saw the true scale of the man. He wasn't just a soldier, he was the personification of a species that had survived its own funeral. "The era of silence is over," Vance said. "We are reclaiming the Helios drive patents. We are reclaiming the colonies you abandoned. And since the Concord failed to protect the sector, the Concord is no longer the sovereign power here. As of this Tuesday, the Black Spiral is the center of the galaxy. Everything else is just a buffer zone." A siren blared. A low, mechanical growl that vibrated through the floor plates. One of the human technicians called out, "Admiral, the Voss warlord is requesting a parley. He claims he has hostages from the inner rim." Vance didn't even look at the comms tech. "Target his life support modules. Don't hit the hostages. We'll need them for the labor crews." "Labor crews?" Thalos gasped. "Admiral, those are Concord citizens." Vance turned his gaze back to the Chancellor. It was the look of an engineer evaluating a faulty component. They were Concord citizens. Now, they're the workforce that's going to help us rebuild the Earth-Moon shipyards. "You left us to die in the silence, Thalos. It's only fair that you help us make some noise." Vance walked toward the edge of the command deck, looking out at the tactical screens where the Voss dreadnoughts were being methodically crushed by kinetic impacts. He didn't look like a man enjoying a victory. He looked like a man finishing a very long, very exhausting shift at a coal mine. "You call us ghosts," Vance said softly, almost to himself. "But ghosts only haunt you. We're here to collect." He turned back to Stark. "Provide the Chancellor with the updated coordinates of the Terran Protectorate. Tell him that if any Concord ship crosses that line without a signed restitution agreement, the railguns will not wait for a handshake protocol." "Admiral," Thalos reached out, a final, desperate plea. "There must be a way to move forward as allies. The Voss are still out there. Their home world is already being targeted by a kinetic kill vehicle," Vance said, his voice as flat as a gravestone. "It's a 5-ton slug of iron traveling at 99% of light speed. It was launched 2 weeks ago. It will arrive at their sun in 3 hours. There is no negotiation with physics, Chancellor. There is only the result." The bridge fell into a silence so absolute that Thalos could hear the hum of the ship's reactor, the sound of a sun being held in a cage. He looked at the humans around him, the tired, efficient, brutal survivors of a betrayal that had lasted 10 generations. He realized then that the galaxy hadn't just made a mistake 300 years ago. They had committed a crime against a predator that didn't know how to forgive. "Take them back to their shuttle," Vance ordered. "We have 6 more systems to invoice before the end of the cycle." As Thalos was led away, he looked back at the tactical table. The Voss fleet was gone. The Concord fleet was drifting. And in the center of the map, a small, blue-white dot was glowing with a new, terrifying intensity. Earth hadn't returned to join the galaxy. It had returned to own it. Part 4. The Imperial Scepter felt like a discarded toy drifting in the wake of a god. As the Xeran flagship maintained its station among the shattered, sparkling rings of Thalos Prime, the vibration of the human engines, the Iron Meridian's heavy, sub-harmonic thrum, refused to dissipate. It was a low-frequency ghost that lived in the deck plates and the marrow of the Xeran survivors. To Chancellor Varen Thalos, it felt less like a sound and more like a countdown. The sky outside was no longer a battlefield, it was a crime scene. The Voss were gone, their once proud organic dreadnoughts now merely cooling slag, but the silence they left behind was far more terrifying than their war cries. The humans had not just defeated them, they had subtracted them from the equation of the system with the cold indifference of an accountant crossing out a line item. Chancellor Thalos did not retreat to the sanctuary of his private chambers. He did not seek the medical bays, despite the fact that his skin was beginning to flake into a dull, stress-induced gray. Instead, he moved toward the archive core, the deepest, most heavily shielded sanctum of the scepter. This was where the history of the Xeran hegemony and the wider Galactic Concord was stored, not in books or digital drives, but in pressurized lattices of solid light. It was a cathedral of memory, and today, Thalos intended to commit a sacrilege. He was followed only by Commander Hicks. The tactical officer's scales were a jittery, translucent strobe of anxiety. Every time a bulkhead groaned or a relay flickered, Hicks flinched. He had seen the humans dismantle physics, he no longer trusted the walls to hold. "The Admiral spoke of the Helios Accords," Thalos said, his voice echoing hollowly against the crystalline pillars of the archive. The air here smelled of cold ozone and the faint, sweet scent of the gas used to stabilize the light lattices. He spoke of 2149 as if it were a wound that had never been allowed to scab. He didn't speak of war, Hicks. He spoke of a breach of contract. He spoke of a debt. The Accords were an era of expansion, Chancellor, Hicks whispered, his voice cracking. A golden age. The humans gave us the Helios drive, and we gave them a place in the stars. That is what the textbooks say. That is what the High Senate preaches to every fledgling race. Textbooks are written by the victors who want to sleep at night, Thalos snapped. He reached the central console, a pedestal of obsidian that glowed with an inner, violet fire. Search the redacted logs. Level 9 clearance. I want everything under the Ghost Sector designation. Use the secondary encryption keys, the ones the Zirin High Council keeps for existential contingencies. Keywords: Sol System, Project Eventide, the final sanction. Hicks hesitated, his fingers trembling over the interface. Chancellor, Project Eventide is a myth. It is a tactical ghost story told to Academy cadets to illustrate the dangers of overextending a fleet into unstable sectors. It isn't a historical record. It's a cautionary tale about the Great Silence. The humans are currently turning the Voss hegemony into a kinetic debris field with mythic railguns, Commander. Find the logs. Hicks obeyed. His fingers danced over the light lattice, weaving threads of data together. For several minutes, the room was silent, save for the hum of the cooling fans and the rhythmic thump-thump of the ship's struggling life support. Then, the air in the center of the room curdled. A holographic projection materialized, but it was not the elegant, flowing calligraphy of the Zirins. It was a jagged, high-density data burst, stamped with the brutal, angular seal of the High Senate from 3 centuries ago. The colors were wrong. Harsh reds and blinding whites instead of the soothing violets of the Concord. Accessing, decrypting. Hicks's breath hitched. His scales began to ripple in a slow, horrified wave of bone white. Chancellor, this isn't a trade sanction. It's not a diplomatic quarantine. What is it? Thalos leaned forward, his reflection caught in the obsidian console. It is a kill order, Hicks whispered. A total system neutralization. The projection expanded to show the Sol system as it existed 300 years prior. Earth was there, a vibrant, swirling marble of blue and green, teeming with 1 billion lives. Surrounding it were the infant colonies of the Martian plains and the sprawling industrial habitats of the asteroid belt. The data highlighted the Helios drive, a human invention that had terrified the Council. It didn't just jump through space, it anchored itself to the metric tensor of the universe, allowing for near-instantaneous travel without the resonance fatigue that limited Zirin and Voss technology. The Council hadn't just feared the volatility of the human spirit. They feared the obsolescence of their own power. If humanity were allowed to spread, the Zirin monopoly on interstellar trade, the very foundation of the Concord's economy, would vanish in a single generation. Project Eventide, Thalos read, the words tasting like poison on his tongue. Initiated 2150. Objective: permanent neutralization of the Terran threat via environmental destabilization. The map shifted. A massive, Zirin-built device, a gravity well generator of a scale that made the iron meridian look like a pebble, had been towed under cloak into the Oort cloud of the Sol system. It was the singularity anchor. It wasn't meant to block trade ships. They tethered them, Thalos realized, his knees buckling. They didn't just ignore Earth. They used the anchor to link the Sol Sun's gravity to the Black Spiral, the cluster of neutron stars 3,000 light-years away. They used humanity's own Helios tech to create a permanent wormhole, but instead of travel, they used it for weight. The logs detailed the success of the mission with a clinical, terrifying detachment. As the anchor engaged, the Sol Sun began to distort, its plasma being sucked toward a distant, invisible point in the void. Earth's orbit began to wobble, its distance from the Sun fluctuating wildly. The tides rose into tsunamis that swallowed continents. The atmosphere began to thin as the solar wind was stripped away by the gravitational shear. The Council had sat in their elegant chambers on Thalos Prime, the very chambers currently burning under Voss bombardment, and they had watched the telemetry. They had listened to the human transmissions. The logs contained audio fragments. At first, they were confused pleas for scientific cooperation, then desperate prayers for rescue, and finally, the raw, guttural screams of a species undergoing tectonic agony as their crust began to crack. And then, silence. The Council had declared the sector haunted and unstable, a ghost sector, where the laws of physics had broken due to a natural catastrophe. They wiped the star charts clean. They erased the name Earth from the galactic lexicon. They had murdered a cradle world to protect their profit margins, and then they had forgotten they had done it. But they didn't die, Hicks said, his eyes wide and fixed on a secondary data stream. Chancellor, Look at the telemetry from the last 60 years. The probes we sent to monitor the anomaly. They were being intercepted. The black spiral isn't empty. The humans, they didn't fight the gravity anchor. Thalos looked. A new image appeared, captured by a deep-range reconnaissance drone that had been marked as lost decades ago. It showed the heart of the black spiral, a nightmare region of space where 3 dead neutron stars spun in a murderous dance. But in the center of that gravitational hell was a structure that defied every law of Xeran architecture, every principle of aesthetic grace. It was the world engine. The humans had taken the very device meant to kill them, the singularity anchor, and they had disassembled it. They had used its parts to build a scaffold around the colliding neutron stars. They hadn't tried to escape the black spiral. They had moved into it. They had built a Dyson lattice not around a living, gentle sun, but around the most violent energy sources in the known universe. They spent 300 years living in a pressure cooker, Thalos whispered, his voice trembling with a mix of horror and a forbidden kind of respect. Every generation born in the dark, under a gravity load that would crush a Xeran into a puddle of organic waste. They didn't just survive the trap. They turned the trap into a forge. They didn't build ships to sail the stars. They built ships to survive the weight of them. The archives showed the evolution of a species under extreme duress. The humans had changed. Their bodies were denser, their bones reinforced by the very gravity that sought to break them. Their eyes had evolved to see in the infrared spectrum of the neutron star's thermal bleed. They had abandoned the concepts of art, comfort, and leisure. They had stripped their own dying planets for iron and tungsten. They had lived in hulls of matte black steel because paint was a luxury they couldn't afford and light was something they had to steal from the void. They had become a species of engineers and executioners, forged in the very darkness the Council had intended to be their grave. Admiral Vance wasn't lying, Hicks said, his voice a ragged sob. They've been watching us. They've been tapping into our resonance comms for a century. They waited until the Voss weakened our borders. They waited until our elegant shields were the only things left between us and total extinction. Because they wanted the Voss to do the heavy lifting, Thalos realized. The cold logic of it was devastating. They wanted the Voss to dismantle the old order. They wanted the Concord to be broken, desperate, and bankrupt. We aren't being rescued, Hicks. We are being foreclosed upon. We are the collateral for a 300-year-old debt. A chime sounded on the Scepter's bridge, a sharp, dissonant tone that overrode every security protocol in the archive core. It wasn't the Voss. It was the humans. Admiral Vance's face appeared on the central light pillar. He looked even older in the harsh, unfiltered light of the Xeran scanners. His skin was the color of parched earth, his eyes twin pits of cold, calculating fire. He was sitting in that same swivel chair on the Iron Meridian, the steam from his cup rising like a funeral shroud. I see you've managed to crack the Eventide files, Chancellor, Vance said. There was no anger in his voice. Anger was an emotion for the living, for those who still had hope. Vance spoke with the terrifying, flat certainty of a machine. It's quite a read, isn't it? A masterpiece of galactic diplomacy. The enlightened Xeran hegemony, murdering 3 billion volatiles to keep their trade routes clear of competition. Admiral, Thalos stammered, his dignity stripped away, leaving only a frightened old man. I truly had no knowledge. The records were buried under 7 layers of state-secret encryption. The men who did this are long dead. My generation, we only knew the silence. Buried under the weight of 3 billion lives, Vance finished for him. My ancestors didn't have the luxury of not knowing. They had to learn how to breathe recycled, liquid-scrubbed oxygen and how to build ship hulls that could withstand the pull of a neutron star without folding like paper. They had to watch their children grow up with stunted limbs and eyes that only saw the heat of the machines because you decided we were an inconvenience. Vance leaned closer to the pickup, his face filling the archive. We didn't just harness the black spiral, Thalos. We mapped it. We found the resonant frequencies of your treasury worlds. We found the structural weak points of every Voss shipyard. We have been the ghosts in your machines for 3 centuries. We didn't need to attack you. We just needed to wait for the universe to do what it always does to the soft and the arrogant. What do you want? Thalos asked, his voice a broken rasp. I want what's written on the invoice, Vance said. The Voss sun is currently being bombarded by a kinetic kill slug. It will go nova in less than 2 hours. That takes care of the immediate nuisance. But the debt of 2,150 remains unpaid. As of this moment, the Terran Protectorate is declaring all Concord claimed space as distressed assets. Vance tapped a command on his desk. We are moving the 2nd and 4th fleets into the Inner Rim. We will be occupying your trade hubs. We will be dismantling your High Senate. We will be taking back every scrap of Helios technology you stole, and we will be charging you for the rental time, with interest calculated in tonnage of raw material. You are becoming the very monsters you claim we are. Thalos shouted, a final, desperate spark of his old chancellor's pride flickering. You speak of justice, but you bring only tyranny and iron. You are no better than the Voss. Vance didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. No, Chancellor. The Voss kill for glory. You killed for comfort. We aren't killing anyone who doesn't stand in the way of the work. You were monsters who pretended to be poets. You killed with silence and signatures. We are engineers who have stopped pretending that the universe is anything other than a machine. We aren't here to rule your souls. We're here to manage the liquidation of a failed state. The transmission cut with a sharp, electronic snap. The holographic projection of the Sol system flickered and died, plunging the archive core into a darkness that felt suffocating. Outside the viewport, the stars of the black spiral seemed to lean closer. They were no longer distant, mythic points of light. They were the cold, unblinking eyes of a predator that had finally emerged from the deep woods. The humans hadn't come to start a war. They were coming to collect the interest on an execution that had failed. Commander, Thalos said, turning toward the exit with the slow, heavy gait of a man walking to the gallows. Signal the remaining fleets. Tell them to power down their resonance shields. Tell them to vent their weapons ports. Chancellor? Hicks asked, his voice small. You cannot fight the tide, Hicks. And you certainly cannot fight the man who built the dam. We aren't a civilization anymore. We are just item 5 on a very long, very bloody invoice. Thalos walked out of the archive, his ceremonial robes of woven light fiber feeling like a leaden shroud. He looked at his hands, soft, unscarred, the hands of a man who had spent his life signing papers and drinking nectar. He thought of the grease-stained, calloused hands of the human deck crews he had seen on the Meridian. He thought of the rivets and the scars on their ships. The era of elegance, of light, and of soft lies was over. The galaxy had tried to drown humanity in the dark. Now, the humans were bringing the dark back with them, and it was made of cold iron and unstoppable kinetic energy. The invoice was due, and the humans did not accept apologies as currency. They only accepted the weight of the universe. Part 5. The supernova of the Voss home star did not arrive as a flash of light to the survivors on Thalos Prime. It arrived as a data point on a human terminal. On the bridge of the Iron Meridian, Admiral Vance did not celebrate. He did not call for a toast or offer a speech about the triumph of justice. He simply watched a tiny, flickering icon on his tactical display turn from a vibrant amber to a hollow gray. The kinetic kill slug, launched weeks prior from the depths of the black spiral, had found its mark. It had struck the Voss sun at 99% of light speed, the mass of a mountain compressed into a needle of tungsten, and the resulting solar collapse had been instantaneous. The Voss hegemony, a civilization that had spent a millennium perfecting the art of cruelty, had been erased by the physics of a hammer hitting a nail. Item 4 is settled, Vance said, his voice level and devoid of heat. Proceed to Item 5. Begin the descent. Above Thalos Prime, the sky began to fill with shapes that were not ships of war, but something far more invasive. They were collector vessels, massive, multi-kilometer spiders of exposed girders, grappling arms, and industrial magnets. They did not look like the sleek, starlit hulls of the Concord. They looked like the skeletal remains of a city that had decided to fly. As they descended through the atmosphere, they didn't fire weapons. They fired anchors, massive harpoons of magnetized iron that slammed into the crystalline spires of the High Senate, the trade guilds, and the resonance power stations. The elegant architecture of the Xeran hegemony groaned and shattered under the weight of human engineering. Chancellor Varan Thalos stood on the balcony of the High Senate, watching the harpoons descend. Beside him, the remaining members of the council were a kaleidoscope of terror, scales flashing in panicked reds, wings fluttering in frantic distress, psychic fields leaking the smell of rotted ozone. They had spent their lives debating the nuances of trade law and the aesthetics of diplomatic poetry. They were utterly unprepared for a species that treated the world as a construction site. A human dropship, a scarred box of reinforced composite, touched down on the Senate Plaza. The ramp hissed open, venting the sharp, recycled air of the black spiral. There were no honor guards. No fanfare, only a team of humans in heavy, powered exoskeletons, carrying data slates and industrial cutting torches. Admiral Vance was at their head. He stepped onto the crystalline tiles of Thalos Prime, his heavy, rubber-soled boots making a dull thwack that seemed to offend the very air of the refined capital. He walked past the statues of ancient Xeran heroes as if they were obstacles in a warehouse. He reached the High Chancellor. Thalos looked at Vance, and for the first time, the Xerans saw the true horror of the situation. Vance wasn't looking at him as an enemy. He wasn't looking at him as a victim. He was looking at him as a tenant who hadn't paid the rent in 3 centuries. "The Senate is dissolved, Chancellor," Vance said, handing a data slate to Thalos. "This is the formal notice of liquidation. As of 0600 hours, all sovereignty of the Galactic Concord is suspended. The Terran Protectorate has assumed administrative control over all resource nodes, trade arteries, and manufacturing hubs. You cannot simply dissolve 1,000 years of history," a Xeran senator shrieked, his scales a vibrating purple. "We are the Concord. We are the light of the galaxy." Vance turned his gaze toward the senator. The human's eyes were infrared adapted, glowing with a faint, predatory heat in the shadows of his brow. "The Concord is a bankrupt entity. You defaulted on your debt in 2150 when you attempted to murder our species to protect your profit margins. You've been living on stolen time ever since." He gestured to the sky, where the collector ships were already beginning to dismantle the orbital shipyards. Massive sections of Xeran crystal lattice were being sheared away by human cutting beams, to be melted down for their raw silicates. "We aren't here to rule you," Vance continued, walking toward the central dais of the Senate. He sat on the edge of the Chancellor's desk, a gesture of profound disrespect that no alien would have dared. "Ruling requires a belief in the value of the subject. We don't value your politics. We don't value your art. We value the mass of your systems and the energy of your stars. We are here to manage the assets." "And what of our people?" Thalos asked, his voice trembling. "What of the billions of Xerans, the Grell, the Xylos? Are we to be slaves?" "Slaves are inefficient," Vance replied, tapping a command on his slate. "You will be labor. We are reopening the Helios shipyards. We are rebuilding the trade routes, but they will be Terran routes. You will work to pay off the interest on the Eventide sanction. Every kilowatt of energy you produce, every gram of ore you mine, goes toward the debt. When the debt is settled, roughly 6 generations from now, by our calculations, we might discuss your autonomy. Until then, you are components in the world engine." The realization hit the council like a kinetic slug. This wasn't a change in government. It was a change in the nature of reality. The galaxy was being turned into a factory, and they were merely the biological sensors required to keep it running. "The Voss," Thalos whispered. "You destroyed their sun. Millions of innocents." "The Voss were a variable that introduced too much friction into the system," Vance said. "We don't like friction. It wastes energy. They were a threat to the productivity of the sector, so they were removed. If the Concord attempts to resist, you will be classified as friction as well." Vance stood up and looked out over the plaza. Human surveyor drones were already buzzing through the air, mapping the city with lidar, marking which buildings would be kept for administrative use and which would be demolished to make room for mass driver silos. "You called humanity a ghost sector," Vance said, turning back to Thalos. "You thought we were a legend that had faded into the vacuum. You were wrong. We were just the machine you forgot to turn off. We spent 300 years in the black spiral, learning that the universe doesn't care about your songs or your light fiber robes. The universe only cares about mass and momentum." He leaned in, his face inches from Thalos's. "You tried to drown us in the dark. But humans don't drown. We just learn how to hold our breath. And now, we're the ones who decide when you get to breathe." Vance turned and walked back toward his dropship, his team already beginning to set up a perimeter of automated sentry turrets around the Senate. They worked with a terrifying, silent competence, no orders shouted, no wasted movement. They were a species that had perfected the art of the task. As the dropship lifted off, Thalos looked up at the iron meridian. It hung in the sky like a tombstone for the old galaxy. Behind it, the stars of the black spiral were visible even in the daylight, a cluster of cold, hard points of light that seemed to be drawing the rest of the galaxy into their orbit. The era of light was gone. The era of elegance had been dismantled by men with wrenches and railguns. Thalos looked down at the data slate Vance had left him. It wasn't a manifesto. It wasn't a declaration of war. It was a list of mineral quotas and labor shifts. It was a schedule for the dismantling of his world. In the distance, the first of the great crystalline towers of Thalos Prime began to collapse, not from a bomb, but from the methodical removal of its structural supports by a human salvage crew. The sound of the falling glass was like the ringing of 1,000 bells, a funeral dirge for the Galactic Concord. Humanity hadn't come back to save the galaxy. They had come back to put it to work. And as the heavy, rhythmic thud of human mass drivers began to echo from the moon, Thalos finally understood. The ghost story was over. The reality of iron had arrived. And the universe would never be quiet again.